Hello, welcome to the second session of the Gigapixel Panoramic Photography Online Workshop. I am John Freeman and I will be your host. In this session we are going to explore how to maximize your camera's dynamic range. During this session we're going to be talking about a photo shooting technique known as exposed to the right, or ETTR. Over the years, as I have perfected my gigapixel photography techniques, I found that scenes I wanted to photograph often had such a wide variation of lighting that it was difficult to get good exposure throughout the dozens, hundreds, or possibly even thousands of photos that I would shoot to make up one of my gigapixel photos. Years ago, I would shoot exposure bracketed and use HDR processing with mixed results. Some 6 to 7 years ago, I began to experiment with ETTR and found that I could get as good a results as I did with HDR. Then, as I advanced on to doing focus stacked sets, I found that my cameras could not do both focus bracketed and exposure bracketed at the same time. These days, I almost always use ETTR anytime I have a scene that has a wide variation of light. For many newer photographers, it's very common for them to set the camera to auto or programmable mode, hoping for great results. Most of our modern digital cameras do a fairly good job of automatically selecting shutter speeds, aperture, and ISO to shoot the many shooting situations they may find themselves in. However, in situations like my wife found herself in when she attempted to shoot a photo of me working on a panorama of the Crystal Mill, her Canon T5's automatic mode failed to give her the optimum settings. The camera's evaluative mode exposure took into consideration both the bright waterfall area and the deep shadows of the mill and where I was standing, and selected an exposure that left me in deep shadows such that you can barely make out my face, and the shady side of the mill is also way too dark. Using Adobe Camera Raw, I was able to open up the dark areas enough that I am recognizable. However, that part of the image is noisy and lacking in detail. One of the more significant steps a photographer makes in their advancement in photography is that they decide to set their camera to manual mode instead of using the programmable modes. This step often yields a major improvement in their photos if, that is, they take the time to learn the technical considerations required to properly utilize manual mode. Simply switching to manual mode would not have solved my wife's dilemma in this case, however. Using the light meter in her camera and setting the exposure level to 0 at the middle of the exposure meter would have yielded the same results as she got in P mode. In this session, we're going to explore how using ETTR, exposed to the right methods, to maximize your camera's dynamic range to avoid underexposing the dark areas of the scene without overexposing or blowing out the highlight areas can significantly improve your photos. Our modern-day digital cameras are very technically advanced compared to what we had back in the film days. In the past 6 to 8 years, digital signal processing has even further enhanced the intermediate and prosumer cameras many of us are shooting these days. Yet, a disappointingly large number of users choose to underutilize the powerful tool they hold in their hand. The human eye exhibits a remarkable range of light that it can work with. Our eyes have about 24 stops of range as expressed in camera terms. Man's attempt to design light sensors for cameras has only been able to achieve about half of that, or roughly 10 to 12 stops. A stop, or EV, meaning exposure value, is a unit of light that is used to measure the number of photons of light that lands on a given area. Each reduction of photons by 50% or half is one less stop of light. The typical camera's light meter has a range of -3 to +3 stops. A camera's auto exposure will strive to set the shutter time, aperture, and ISO to a reading in the center of the meter or 0. When shooting in manual mode, conventional wisdom teaches us to also adjust our shutter time, aperture, and ISO also to a reading of 0. We will see in the upcoming slides that ETTR flies in the face of this conventional wisdom and teaching for setting exposure. 0 on the light meter represents 50% gray, or halfway between the darkest and brightest values of light the camera can register. Thus, at -3, the camera will register light at 1/8 of the center 0 value, up to +3, which is 8x the 0 value, for a total range of 6 stops. The range of light in the light meter is about 50 to 60% of the actual 10 to 12 stops of capability our intermediate and prosumer cameras have. On older and entry-level cameras, which peak out at about 8 stops, the ±3 stops represents about 75% of their capability. This chart outlines the range of EVs, or stops, that we may encounter as photographers. The main takeaway I want to derive from this chart for you is that for landscape photography during daylight, we may experience up to 10 to 12 stops of light variation between brightly lit clouds to the shadows in deep canyons. The exact situation where maximizing your camera's dynamic range becomes critical to avoid too much noise in the dark areas while avoiding blowing out the clouds. Sorry, but for this and the next few slides, I'm going to have to get into some of the technical details of the inner workings of your camera. I'm going to try to explain it in as non-technical terms as possible. What we have here is a block diagram of a basic digital camera. On the left we see the lens, next the sensor, and then the two critical blocks, the AGC and the ADC. Understanding a little about their function is essential to understanding the rest of what I'm going to talk about in this session. The AGC, which means adjustable gain control, is your ISO setting. Think of it as your volume control on your car radio. Increasing the ISO amplifies the signal coming from the sensor. The sensor, in combination with the AGC, are among the most critical portions of your camera's electronics. Going back to that car radio example, consider you dial it to an AM frequency where there is no station. You will hear a lot of hiss and static. This is the background noise of the electronics. Now turn the volume up to full blast. The hiss and static would drive you right out of the car. This is effectively what you're doing when you crank up the ISO of your camera. Now turn the volume back down to normal, and the hiss and static is tolerable. Next, tune in a good strong radio station, and you can drive down the road enjoying a good tune with a minimal amount of irritation from the hiss and static. In the electronics world, we call this the signal-to-noise ratio. The stronger the signal-to-noise ratio, the better the quality of the sound, or picture in the case of our cameras. The ADC, which means analog to digital converter, converts the analog signal coming from the AGC into digital bits or bytes, representing the intensity of light landing on the sensor elements. The greater number of bits the ADC is capable of generating, the more accurate the digital representation of the image is. The domesticating and image processing sections scan through the entire sensor element, building the image file, and finally the image gets stored onto your memory card. The bits referred to are how many levels of tone, think brightness, are recorded in each color channel, R, G, and B, of an image. 8 bits means that each color channel has 256 different levels of tone that can be recorded. All JPEG files are 8 bits per channel. If we multiply the 3 channels together, 256 times 256 times 256, we end up with 16,777,216 colors that can be represented for each photo site on the sensor. Most newer intermediate and prosumer cameras have 12 or 14-bit ADCs and store the image in RAW files in that same 12 to 14-bit format. 12 bits is capable of recording 4,096 different tones, while the 14-bit ADC is capable of generating 16,384 tones. Doing some math, a 12-bit format yields 4,096 times 4,096 times 4,096, or roughly 68.7 billion colors. While a 14-bit format yields 16,384 times 16,384 times 16,384 for roughly 4.39 trillion colors. The human eye can only discern about 10 million different colors. So saving an image in any more than 256 JPEG format is excessive if the only intended purpose is viewing online in Facebook, Instagram, and the like. Why then, you may ask, do I need more than a 256-bit system? It all goes back to that signal-to-noise ratio that we discussed a few minutes ago, and what I'm going to show you in the next few slides. When you open the shutter, each photo site or element of your camera starts counting the photons that land on that photo site. In a very dark area of a scene, very few, say some 25 or 30 photons, may land on the photo site. Likewise, that very bright cloud may result in upwards of 16,000 or more photons landing on the corresponding photo site. In a 14-bit digital recording system, the brightest stop uses 50% of the 16,384 possible values. So within this brightest stop area, it can record 8,192 unique values. For stop 2, it can only record half that many values, which is 4,096 values. At each stop, toward the darkest on the left, each stop has half as many values as the previous stop. So in this example, at the darkest stop, 7, we are only able to record 256 unique values. This is exacerbated by the fact that in the analog part of the system, all the noise occurs in or below the 7th stop. Therefore, one can quickly discern that this 7th stop area and darker are areas you probably want to avoid using. For a camera that only records with 12 bits, we see that this problem is even worse, with only 64 unique values in this darkest stop area. This chart makes it quite evident that it would be to our advantage to utilize as much of the rightmost stops as possible. This, in a nutshell, is the theory behind the ETTR concept. The further to the right we expose, the better the signal-to-noise ratio, therefore the less noisy our photo will be. Now for all you JPEG-only shooters, here is why I never shoot in JPEG. Note the numbers along the bottom scale of this chart. If you have a 14-bit camera and you only shoot in JPEG, you are effectively throwing away 98.4% of your camera's capability. With a 12-bit camera, you're still throwing away 93.75% of your camera's capability. Plus, you lose the advantages of the ETTR shooting in JPEG because you cannot apply any of the post-processing techniques I'm going to show you later. For this chart, I consulted photonstophotos.net, a website operated by William J. Claff, who has done extensive testing of a wide variety of digital cameras over the years. I have selected a variety of prosumer cameras to compare their dynamic range versus ISO setting. The main takeaway that I want you to get from this chart is the fact that your camera exhibits the best dynamic range at its base ISO of 100. For all the ETTR shooting, we are going to strive to shoot at ISO 100. One caveat I would like to point out for all you Canon R series shooters: notice the orange line representing the R5's electronic shutter mode performance is significantly poorer than its mechanical and half shutter performance. This is because when the R5 is operating in electronic shutter mode, it drops to 12-bit mode instead of its native 14-bit mode. This is apparently to support the advertised 20 frames per second burst rate. It apparently cannot process 14-bit data at 20 frames per second. Using focus bracketing mode of the R5 forces it into electronic shutter mode, which is a real bummer for me because I do a ton of focus bracketed shooting. I don't know if the Nikon Z series cameras have this same limitation. Now that we have explored the technical reasons for using ETTR, let's dive into how to do it. The term exposed to the right refers to the histogram. Most of us are familiar with histograms, and common practice is to adjust our exposure so that the majority of the image data is in the center portion of the graph, as shown in the left histogram at the bottom of this slide. Experience has taught me that I rarely see a histogram that looks like this, especially in landscapes shot anywhere near sunrise or sunset. More often than not, I will have a big peak towards the left, not too much in the middle, and another large peak near the right. Sunrises and sunset landscapes shot anywhere in the golden hour are notorious for having very bright areas near the sun and very dark areas in canyons and shadows. Film photographers and many digital photographers have reverted to graduated filters in this kind of a situation, and it does work well. However, a graduated filter simply is not an option when doing a gigapixel photo that consists of multiple rows and columns. Rule number 1 for doing ETTR: you must shoot RAW mode. It does not work with JPEG files because all the valuable data gets thrown away as the camera creates the JPEG file. Doing ETTR takes some practice in fiddling with your camera to learn just how hard to the right you can push your exposures. It is very easy to end up with blown out brights. I suggest that you start experimenting with your camera in a non-mission critical situation. Start conservative at maybe +2 stops and see how that works. Then try +2 1/3 stops. I find that most cameras will tolerate between +2 1/3 and +2 2/3 stops. When I first started trying to do ETTR, I quickly learned that +3 stops was an invitation for blown out brights. Because ETTR involves slowing down your shutter speed some, it can introduce a little extra motion blur if you have lots of moving objects. However, it still has an advantage over HDR shooting in this kind of a situation. With HDR, you're shooting multiple photos, which is very susceptible to having variation of position of moving objects. Also keep in mind that your camera's built-in histogram may not be all that accurate. It will likely indicate that you have significant overexposure. This is because it is derived from an underlying 8-bit JPEG copy the camera generates to use in the display. This JPEG image is used to calculate the histogram from. Many of our newer cameras have a feature people call blinkies that flash black, red, or yellow in overexposed areas. I have my blinkies set at 98% to show me if I have a region that is within 2% of being overexposed. And lastly, you must be prepared to do more post-processing than you would with a normally exposed image. This can be done with either Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, Capture One, Affinity Photo, and Luminar Nero, which each have similar capabilities. Photo Raw also has the same capabilities, and it's the only one I've used at all other than Adobe Camera Raw, but I have very little experience with it. I start by setting my camera to fully manual mode, ISO 100 with spot metering enabled. Spot metering allows you to choose very accurately the area of the scene that you're going to meter your shot at. With spot metering enabled, I pan and tilt around the scene I intend to shoot while observing the exposure meter. I search for the area of the scene that yields the highest exposure reading, such as a white cloud or a sunlit snow. Hovering the spot metering area on the brightest area of the scene, I set the exposure time to a value where the meter is reading plus 2 1/3 stops. I have found that with my Canon R5, this is about as high as I can set it without some risk of having the brightest area of a scene being blown out. I then pan and tilt to the darkest area of the scene to determine if I have enough light in the dark areas. If the exposure meter is pegged to the far left side of the meter, or -3 or less, there's a good chance you will not have good noise-free data in the dark area. If you find that the scene has more than -2 2/3 to +2 2/3 dynamic range, then you need to consider using exposure bracketing and planning to process the image in HDR. One important reminder, that is, if you're going to shoot an HDR image, do not try to use ETTR. Unfortunately, the Canon R series cameras cannot support both exposure bracketing and focus bracketing at the same time. And this is what has forced me to use ETTR as much as I do. I want to emphasize that a big part of the secret behind the usefulness of ETTR is spot metering. With spot metering enabled, only the center 3.5% of the exposure sensor is used. This, with panning and tilting, allows you to home in very accurately onto that brightest area in the scene. Importantly, you should know that ETTR fails miserably with center-weighted or evaluative metering. As I mentioned earlier, ETTR requires additional post-processing. And as I alluded to earlier, ETTR is especially useful when shooting stitched panoramas with dozens or hundreds of images, because when you shoot a wide field of view, there's a far greater chance of having a huge dynamic range. I'm now going to start to demonstrate how I post-process an ETTR photo. Here we have a very typical situation where exposed to the right works very well. The bright light of the sunset is one of the brightest subjects one can choose to try to photograph. If your camera is set such that its exposure meter is set to evaluative or center-weighted metering, because of the dark palm tree in the foreground, the exposure meter will be fooled and will pick an exposure that tries to compensate for the dark areas. The result will be that the brightest areas will be severely overexposed. In a situation like this, spot metering will allow you to evaluate the exposure to make sure the brightest areas are not blown out. This image was shot with my Canon 5DSR, which is well known to exhibit noise in dark underexposed areas, such as the shady part of the palm tree in this scene. I used spot metering to set up this shot, exposing for the brightest area just to the right of the tree and above the horizon. My ISO was set to 100, so to get an exposure level of plus 2 1/3 stops required a shutter time of 1/80th of a second with an f10 aperture. Straight out of the camera, this raw image is pretty much unusable. When we open it in Camera Raw, the histogram shows the brightest areas are blown out. On the other hand, the shadows are very dark, with nearly no detail that can be discerned. But the good news is that we don't have a shadows clipping triangle illuminated. This tells me immediately I have an image that shouldn't exhibit too much noise in the dark areas, and that I should be able to brighten the shadows significantly with minimal noise. I'm now going to switch over to Camera Raw to demonstrate my ETTR processing techniques. Let's start by checking the levels in both the bright and dark areas. Note that I have the Edit tool selected at the top right of the screen, and in the lower right I have the magnifying tool enabled. Now I want you to watch above the histogram as I move the magnifying tool around the image. If I hover over the brightest area of the sunlit horizon, 3 numbers appear above the histogram. These are our RGB values in that area under the magnifying glass. Note that these are all reading 255, which would seem to indicate that the bright area of this image is overexposed, thus blown out. Likewise, if I hover over the darkest regions of the photo, the RGB values may be as low as 4 to 5. Note if they were 0, it would indicate that I have clipping in my darkest areas. As long as I have values above 0, it tells me I have some usable data even in the darkest regions. Now what about those bright areas that seem to be blown out? On a previous slide, you will recall that for the brightest stop with a 14-bit A to D, which the 5DSR has, we have 8,192 levels for stop 1. I want to point out that the histogram in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom also is an 8-bit presentation, even though I have Adobe Camera Raw set to edit in 16-bit ProPhoto mode. Note that in a recent update, as of December 2023, Adobe introduced a new HDR button just below the histogram. This switches the histogram into a 16-bit presentation. Clicking on this button will display a 16-bit histogram. This is very useful to determine if the raw image has any clipping in the bright areas. This is a good way to check if your raw image is overexposed. I'm going to simulate overexposure by sliding the exposure slider to the right, and we will see that I can induce clipping. If this is what your histogram looks like with the exposure slider set to 0, your image is overexposed and incapable of being recovered. For now, I'm going to set the exposure back to 0 and turn off the HDR histogram. Now let's find out if there's any useful information hanging out in that area that shows to be blown out. To find out, I'm going to slide the exposure slider to the left, which will darken the overall image. When I get to about -1 stop, note that the highlight clipping warning indicator goes off. If I continue to slide the exposure slider to the left to about -1.5 stops, the histogram indicates that I have almost no areas of high or overexposure indicated by the fact that the histogram lines are all at 0 on the far right. I can further prove that by hovering the magnifying glass over the brightest regions. The RGB values above the histogram are now all 252, which is pure white, but just below the maximum value of 255. Remember that I spot metered this on the brightest area of the scene at plus 2 1/3 stops. If I move the exposure slider to minus 2 2/3 stops and observe the histogram, I see the brightest areas are represented by a peak just to the left of the right side. Again, hovering the magnifying glass over the brightest areas yields readings around 245 to 246. This tells me that I did a good job of making a judgment call of using plus 2 1/3 stops. And I had slight margin to assure I hadn't overexposed my shot while still utilizing as much of my camera's dynamic range as possible. Considering that I shot this at plus 2 1/3 stops overexposed, you may think that the first step would be to set the exposure slider to minus 2 1/3 stops to compensate for the exposure. But as we see here, that has resulted in the dark areas being way too dark. Even moving the shadow slider to plus 100 fails to recover our darks very much. Most of our data is still bunched up at the far left side of the histogram. Ideally, for good prints, we want the majority of the data to be balanced around the center of the histogram. Our goal is to make adjustments that avoid overexposure of the brights without darkening the dark areas too much. We need to compress the dark to bright range to fit within the dynamic range of our printing device. Virtually all printers, be it your own home printer or a large service bureau printer, work within the sRGB 8-bit or Adobe 1998 RGB 8-bit color space. We are going to be compressing a 12 to 14-bit image to fit within that 8-bit space. We want to recover the information in the dark areas without blowing out the brights. We saw earlier that even setting the exposure meter to minus 1.5 allowed us to avoid clipping in the brights. If we again set the shadow slider to plus 100 with the exposure at minus 1.5, we've improved some on the dark areas, but they are still bunched up and pushed to the left side. We need to do a better job of balancing the compression between the darks and the lights. Let's reset the exposure and shadow sliders back to 0. You can do that by double-clicking on the little indicator on the slider. Notice how the data right at the center has came up a little bit when we do that. We need to retain all of that data. Instead of using the exposure, let's try using the highlight slider. Moving the highlight slider to the left, you will note that only the data in the rightmost 20 to 30% of the histogram is affected. If we set the highlights to minus 30, the peak for the brightest area moves away from the right side and we no longer have a highlights clipping warning. Meanwhile, we've retained all of our dark areas with little or no effect. Now let's try the shadow slider again, moving it to the right. Notice as we move the shadow slider to the right, the data starts to come out in the shadows area in the actual photo on the screen. I will stop at about plus 80. Now we can see the trunk of the palm tree that shows some detail, and the people's faces are starting to become more than dark shadows. I could push the shadow slider all the way to plus 100, and the overall scene is brighter. However, I don't like to do it all with the shadow slider. Now I want to play with the curves. Let's start with the dark slider by bringing it up to about plus 25 and maybe even plus 30. Notice that our histogram is now very nicely balanced between the darks on the left and the lights on the right. The height of the midtones are nearly as high as our darks and highlights. Hovering the magnifying tool over the brightest area, our highest values displayed above the histogram are still around 253. Moving to the darkest areas, we are now getting readings of around 20. The people's faces are now well lit, and there's good detail in the dead leaves of the palm trees. Now let's have a look at the noise in the dark areas. If I click and drag the zoom tool, we can zoom into the dark area of the dead leaves of the palm tree. We see that we do have some noise in these darkest areas. It's a Canon 5DSR. As we noted, it is known to be noisy in underexposed areas. However, because I maximize the dynamic range with ETTR, we have avoided more noise or even clipping in these darkest regions. Now that I've maximized my dynamic range, for my final touches before opening the image in Photoshop, I like to make a few final tweaks to the image. I will start by bumping vibrance and saturation to about plus 13 for each. For all the Canon cameras I've owned, I have found that their colors are always a bit flat in the raw image, and setting vibrance and saturation to plus 13 brings the colors back to what my mind's eye remembers of the scene. Next, then and only then, after all of the above steps are done, I will start to work on the details. Zooming into about 300 so we can see the noise, we can evaluate the effectiveness of the adjustments I'm making. In this case, I'm going to push luminance to 50 and color to 50 and raise the detail slider some. I have only used the new AI noise reduction a few times. Because I am often working with dozens or hundreds of images that are part of a stitched panorama, I want the same exact settings applied to each and every image. I don't trust the AI noise reduction to apply the same adjustment to all the images of a large set of images for a panorama. At this point, I have completed my pre-processing of my image shot with ETTR. From here, we can open the image in Photoshop and make any further adjustments we might want to do. If I'm working on a set of images for a stitched panorama, I will synchronize all the images to the image I have been working on. Often, I may have one image that is dominated by a bright area and yet another image somewhere in the set that is dominated with dark areas. I will bounce back and forth between the brightest and darkest images, fine-tuning my adjustments, synchronizing each time I make any adjustment. Once I get to the point I am satisfied with my adjustments, I will then export the images as TIFF files to be stitched with Petit GUI. To wrap up, let's take a look at the before and after. Here I have two screenshots of the Adobe Camera Raw screens with the unedited image on the left and the edited image on the right. Note the difference in the histograms. of the two versions. Our edited version has no darks crowded up against the left side of this histogram. We have one minor peak at the right side representing the very bright lit area near the sun. Otherwise, we have a very nicely distributed histogram that indicates that if we were to print this image, it should look quite nice on paper. This concludes this session on maximizing your camera's dynamic range. I thank you for your time.